So many of you know me. I'm Lisa Falk. I'm head of community engagement for the museum, and I'll serve as your host this evening and for this series over the next 9 months. I want to welcome you to Arizona State Museum's Zoom Wrapped in Color Talk series. As many of you know, Arizona State Museum is part of the University of Arizona, located in Tucson. We are situated on land that has been home to indigenous people for 13,000 years. And today the Tucson area is home to the O'odham and the Pasquayaqui. And currently, if you don't know, there are 22 federally recognized tribes with reservation lands in the state of Arizona. The museum's collections and research focus on the indigenous people of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, and we present programs exploring the history and cultures of this region. So I'm happy to welcome tonight's speaker, Porfirio Gutierrez, who worked with ASM staff to co-curate the Wrapped in Color exhibit. It's been a couple of years in the making. Porfirio Gutierrez is a California-based Zapotec textile artist and natural dyer. He's born and raised in the historic Zapotec textile community at Tenochtitlan del Valle in Oaxaca, Mexico. His life work has been revitalizing and preserving traditional Zapotec natural dye techniques with a focus on reinterpreting traditional textiles and materials to reflect his distinctive creative vision that incorporates influences from Oaxaca and the modern urban environment of Southern California. Porfirio and his artistic practice have been featured in the New York Times, Vogue magazine, and the Smithsonian's American Indian magazine, as well as by PBS and the BBC. He received the Smithsonian Institution's Artist and Leadership Fellowship Award in 2015, and recently was awarded the Caroline Glose Bailey Foundation Art Prize, which resulted in a solo exhibit. He is currently serving as a master artist in ASM's Honoring Traditions Connecting Indigenous Master and Emerging Artists Across Cultures program. Porfirio Gutierrez's work is in the collections of the Museo Nacional de Culturas Populares, the Fermento Cultural Banamex, Smithsonian's National Museum of American Indian, and the Arizona State Museum. A selection of Gutierrez's dye materials are also documented and added to Harvard Arts Museum's Forbes Pigment Collection. And now I'm going to turn it over to Porfirio.
Chanan, Chandad, Kechinadinara, Kechinadinabe. Rabe basonedius na valaste yutu, stisiniuta yutu, yutu compa na guji. Saludos cordiales a todos, muchísimas gracias por acompañarme, es un honor de estar aquí y compartir con ustedes. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It is an honor and blessing to be here and sharing my work with you guys. I deeply appreciate Lisa Falk, their entire team of Arizona State Museum for the opportunity to share my work and specifically to share a little bit about this Saltillo sarape with the community. So welcome. I am a descendant of the Zapotec nation. The Zapotec people settled on this part of the America today known as Oaxaca, thousands and thousands of years ago. They documented their work through either ceramic. A lot of their work could also be seen in just like some of the images you see here. They developed a calendar, a writing system, work in the arts of ceramic, gold, precious metals, jewelry. And these ancestral way of viewing and understanding the world, it obviously became a syncretism when the Spanish arrived in Oaxaca area about 500 years ago. We still dance for for the greater being. Our dances, it's offering and a commitment to our church, to the community, to our family. The different ceremonies and different milestones of our life has to do with not only honoring our loved ones or not only honoring the celebration itself, but also understanding the land and understanding the sacredness of even the food. Dia de los Muertos is celebrated the 1st and 2nd of November. And through this celebration, we believe that our ancestors come and visit us. We believe that when someone passes in our family or in our community or in our nation for that matter, that the soul goes to live in a spirit world and that soul comes back to visit us. This is part of the Dia de los Muertos celebration. We honor them through the food, the incense, candles, and specific flowers like Flor de Muerto, which it's only used for that particular celebration. The corn, it's a big reference to the accomplishment of the agriculture sector of today known as the Oaxaqueño people that started to be domesticated in the area 6,000 years ago. I was born and raised in a family of musicians, ceremonial teachers and practitioners, the spiritual ceremony of feather dancing, as well as farming. My father has been farming since a very young age, along with my mother. And just the fact that I was born and raised through this family and in this community, I also received the tradition of the weaving. My mother is a herbalist, or has tremendous amount of knowledge and wisdom when it comes to traditional medicine. So I grew up with the understanding of medicine, plant as medicine. I grew up with understanding that the plants are alive just like us, and anything that moved, it gives us, or everything that moves in the universe has a soul. I used to help out my parents to collect some of the plants that my mother uses for medicine, and 1 or 2 plants that it's used for dyes, because by the time I was growing up, the traditional or the ancestor knowledge of natural dyeing was already extinct and disappeared by the time I was growing up. My mother, and as you see in one of the images here, she grew up with knowing and helping out my parents, or my father, I'm sorry, in a collaboration team. She would do the carding, she would do the dyeing and spinning, and my dad would do the weaving. And by the time they were growing up, or by the time they're starting out their family, what is now known as rugs was still blankets to wear, as blankets, of course, but also as an enredo. Like if you can see, my mother still wears her traditional enredo. So a lot of the medicine practice of my mother happens in the river, especially on the foothills of the mountains. My mother always says that water is a life, and doing or using the force of nature to heal was obviously very important, because not only that, because of the water is alive, but it's bringing the force of nature. So I was growing up among friends and family and the community that's so vivid in the with color and textiles, the symbolism, the different aspects of creating each piece was evident in different aspects and different stages of our lives. I grew up with playing with the bobbins, with the shuttle that my father used, with the pedals of my father's loom. And growing up, understanding weaving, it's almost like at the same time learning your native language, my native language. It is that common. It is something that we do. It is something that we are born in. So for me, that was extremely special. And later in life, that became such a strong cultural identity. I started to weave when I was 12 years old, formally. My father taught me how to weave. But at 18 years old, I left. I migrated to Ventura, California, where I'm in right now. And I left looking for different or other opportunities. So it took me a long time to be able to visit or revisit my hometown in Teotitlan. This entire time, which is almost 10 years that I was absent from the village, I was completely detached to the culture, to the food, to the community of Oaxaqueños that lives here. So I really focus on understanding and being part of this nation, learning the language and so forth. And by the time I had the opportunity to visit Oaxaca, I was able to reconnect with my cultural identity through the arts. But not only just to reconnect with it, I was, and throughout the visits in Oaxaca, I became mindful about my calling, or as my mother says it, Jan Dios golek is in golek ji teach ba lesiante gonya mandani ronyana. What my mother would say is that the greater being blessed my hands to do the job that I'm doing today. So it's a little different approach and little different understanding from what I grew up with and to after I had resumed my art form. 16 years ago, when I visited, I noticed that the natural dye tradition was completely already extinct by then, because I was not aware of anybody that was using natural dye. There were, of course, later on, I found out there was a couple other families that were also trying to revitalize this tradition. But for me, I was really drawn by this ancestral understanding of natural dye and why it was not practiced anymore. And also I started to look so much into how the natural dye tradition has been depleted since the late 1800s, when chemical dyes arrived in Mexico, and into late 60s and early 70s, when a more commercial tourism and a more mass tourism that started to visit Oaxaca, that's demanding for something cheap and faster when it comes to artesanía or textiles. So that completely depleted the natural dye tradition within our community. So these are the things that I was really drawn by, and I was really concerned about these things. One of the things that it really concerned me is that how that the deepness and the knowledge of our ancestors was not conveyed through our textiles or through the colors anymore. And that how our textile tradition is just driven by a tourism that is just making something that tourism will want, but it's not has the soul or the value of our ancestors anymore. I was also really drawn to creating something that shares my personal experience in life and the visual of understanding of a contemporary textile tradition that for me, at that point, I obviously did not have a clear view of what are the designs and body of work I was going to create, but I was definitely committed to create something that could really speak my vision. So that is 16 years ago that I founded my first studio. This is in Teotitlán del Valle, in my community, involving family member with the guidance of my parents as one of the elders of the community members and the greater community of cochineal farmers, indigo farmers, and spinners, and so forth. Something that is obviously very relevant to our culture is the cochineal insect. I discovered this insect by being a shepherd. From 9 years old to like 11, 12 years old, I was a shepherd. So I spent a lot of time, or actually every day, almost every day of my life, those 3 or 4 years, or I spent it in the mountains. So I ran into the cochineal insect on the cactus, just pinching these white dots that you see here in the image. I discovered this incredible color that's revealed after you pinch the cochineal insect. I also discovered other plants like seco. Seco, it's a plant, and this is my native language. It's a plant that gives some purple flower, and when you squeeze or when you rub the flower in your fingers, it gives you purple. Does not specifically give you, that does not mean it gives you the color for dyeing, but it stains. And as a kid, I used to remember coloring my shirt or my hat or my slingshot. So that is my connection and my discovering to the color itself when understanding cochineal insect. But later on in life, I began to do a little bit of research, especially when I resumed my art practice, try to understand what is cochineal insect, what it has been to us for my ancestors. And I start to finding that cochineal insect, it was one of the oldest pigment in Mexico. It was used for medicine. The color red itself was used for different rituals like burials. It has a relation to the gods. And the Mesoamerica or the ancestral or ancient Mexico was obviously very colorful. We see a lot of red colors. Of course, indigo was one of also a very important element in the ancient Mexico. Cochineal insect is a scale insect that it's breed on Apuntia ficus, a prickly pear cactus, that it's a female insect that gives the color red. The cochineal insect that it's used for the dyes and it has been using for dyes for thousands of years was domesticated by the indigenous people of Mexico thousands of years ago. From a wild cochineal insect to what is now known as Dactylopius coccus, or cochinilla as we know it. In my language, the name of it is Babia. My ancestors has been using, and historically Oaxaca itself has had a deep relationship with farming cochineal insect. So when I'm working with these insects, I refer to them as something that is clearly alive, just like me, myself. I approach them with the deep respect as my ancestors have done. And the practice that or the motion or my everyday working with these insects has a link to my ancestors. And what I'm doing is I'm just a conduit of preservation and keeping this tradition alive. And of course, implement them in my work as my ancestors have done for thousands of years ago. Cochineal insect, it is very sensitive to pH. So therefore, it'll start to creating different colors to either expose the insect into a more alkalinity or to a more base environment or acid environment. To create different shades of red, it can obviously take days or weeks depending on the element the materials that you're working with is either protein fiber or cellulose fiber. Also depending on the shades that you are making or you are trying to create. When I think about my practice today as a living history or as a living tradition, I'm looking at it as a second phase of practice and creating color. My parents, they use pots, clay pots to create and ferment some of the elements, a few elements that they work with. I could imagine my ancestor also worked with clay pots. Now I work with metals like stainless steel, iron, and so forth that helps to create a much more larger vocabulary of colors. When I think about the color red itself, I think about the meaning that it had, the meaning and the spiritual, specifically the spiritual meaning that I had with my ancestors. And of course, so much has gotten lost since the colonization. And something that it's obviously very clear and how this tradition, it's still alive and the memories of our ancestors are still alive. It is through different celebration and ceremonies that still happens within our community. Here in this image, we can see women wearing an enredo with the sash. And we can see that the sash and enredo has to be red. So the color red has obviously been used within celebration like weddings and so forth. But here in this particular ceremonies, it's used in a spiritual ceremony that these kind of things gives me a deep understanding that this color itself was something that has to do and has to be developed through our faith and the spiritual aspects of our beliefs by my ancestors. Comparing to Europe, as many of us has maybe read about this, that the color red symbolized power and wealth. And that they had a law in Europe that only certain status of people could wear status of wealth of community members that can only wear red or purple. when they arrive in Mexico, I could imagine that they see red everywhere. These are some of the things that I like to meditate and compare to how two worlds or how two different civilization or how different parts of the world of different society understands the colors and have understand color historically. Saltillo sarape. What is a saltillo? Well, saltillo, it is, to us in Oaxaca, we also refer to it as poncho or a gaban. So it is a blanket, perhaps, that has a slit in the center, and that slit goes over your head. Like you see in one of the images here on the top right, where the horseman is wearing a saltillo and it's just kind of laying over the front part of it's laying over his shoulder. Where saltillo comes from and how saltillo came to be about. Well, historians still don't know where saltillo and how saltillo was developed or where it came from for that matter. Through my research, I started to understand that the saltillo sarape was developed when the Spanish arrived in Mexico and created these, what is now known as sarape, acknowledging obviously the masters, weavers, indigenous people of Mexico, and started to develop these very, very unique type of textiles that up until that point has not been created, or a saltillo sarape has not been developed prior to that, obviously not even maybe not in Mexico, maybe not in Europe, but obviously some of the reference of where the inspiration of saltillo or a sarape might have came from is the top left image that you see on your screen here, that it's the Aztec warrior priest depicting, and this is in the Codex Mendoza, wearing a tilmatli, that it's not a sarape, but it is very similar concept. And I also, through my research, I started to see these medallion-like, that it's obviously has origin in Middle East, that maybe came through Morocco, Spain, and made it into Mexico. And these are some of the things that I actually start to find through my research of the natural dye tradition. So again, when I was growing up, or specifically when I resumed my art form, the natural dye tradition was already extinct. So I started to doing a lot of research within the community, but also outside of the community. Part of my fellowship at the Smithsonian, I spent a number of weeks looking at how color was used, what are the colors that might have been used in Oaxaca or in my village, looking at really old textile from the 1800s, from the 1900s, just textiles that survive, of course, because as we know, textile is perishable. And I started to find these textiles that it clearly show a lot of cochineal insect, indigo, and other element of yellow that could have been as lugiag or lichen or tree moss. So these are some of the things that I was looking at, I was focusing to paying attention, and I was, spending my energy and understanding about the natural dye, trying to revitalize them. And it is obviously, I couldn't ignore these incredible textile that I started to see. Not only that was made in Mexico overall, but specifically in Oaxaca. And that's how I discovered the incredible saltillo sarape. The image that we see here on our lower right part, that is a saltillo influenced or inspired on the saltillo sarape that was made in Oaxaca. So why it's called saltillo sarape? Why Saltillo? Well, we know that there's a state named Saltillo in Oaxaca, and this type of work was developed in Saltillo, and then later on and over the years has spread throughout of Mexico and even in Guatemala and the Southwest and so forth, and how it influenced and other or was a source of inspiration for other weavers like Navajos. In some of my research, I spent a little bit of time with Mark Wenter, which he's actually one of the big reference through my research as well when it comes to Saltillo. So that consequently began to have an influence within my work. And I started to develop these body of work that are referred to as fragments. Why fragments? I titled them fragments because what is left of my culture after the Spanish arrived, it is just a fragment. It is just bits and pieces of our ancestral knowledge and wisdom that has survived up into the modern day. Also, this body of work pay homage to indigenous slaveries, dyers and weavers who developed and helped and infuse, or how do I say that, put in their knowledge, their wisdom, but also their artistic sensibility in developing the Saltillo sarape. So the piece that you look at here, it's one of the pieces within the series. This is clearly the design you see, a band that you see that looks like two fishes coming together. That is a clearly design that was developed through this syncretism, part of the Saltillo design, Saltillo sarape designs. But for me, I refer to these designs as the sacred plant, which is corn. And this is a corn plant that is speaking into a corrosion of our culture and nature. And what you see here is the kernels that are falling. Of course, the background is evident that it's Cochineal Insect, but also other designs that just comes to be about. It's either through my spiritual belief, or just these are just elements that it comes to be very drawn. I was very drawn by the movement, by the explosion of color or the design, the complexity, but at the same time, very minimal compared to a Saltillo sarape. Very abstract of expressing the same elements that the ancestral indigenous people of Mexico developed and worked through. And these designs that might have meant something to them, or maybe not, but to us within our culture, this is a butterfly design. And when I think about the butterfly design, it does not only help to transport my imagination into my ancestor or the spiritual life of my ancestors, but also this connection to the indigenous people that developed this art form and the homage to them, and the labor intensive that these work took into creating. Saltillo sarape is one of the finest textiles in Mexico, and one of the most remarkable weaving that was created during this colonization. Of course, prior to the Spanish, my ancestor and the indigenous people of Mexico was already creating work that is extremely fine, that was used for ceremonies, for everyday use. But Saltillo sarape, I think it was something obviously not only very special because it developed within this colonization period of time, but also it's mainly its use, it's wool. As we know, wool was brought to us by the Spanish, but not only that it was with wool, this type of design was used or was woven in a thread loom, fixed frame pedal loom, which you see in one of the images coming up. It is a loom that was brought to us by the Spanish, and these pieces were made extremely, extremely fine. So not only the spinner has to be mastered, but also the weaver, and the weaver not only has to be extremely good to weave the pieces, not only because they're fine, but because there is at least 22 and more warp threads to an inch. And for those of you that might not know what it's a warp thread, so it is the foundation, it is the structure of the piece itself. So the fringe you see on each end of the design you're looking at in your screen, the white fringe you see, that is part of the warp. So the design was created within that warp, but the warp is covered. And that's also one of the reference, something that we know that this is a tapestry weaving technique. Another aspect that why the weaver has to be very precise. So only the last maybe 50 years, we started to have bigger looms and wider looms in our communities in Mexico. So by the time this type of work was made, it was made in 2 different panels because the looms were very narrow. And to make a matrimonial or to make a full size blanket, or in this case, sarape, the weaver had to weave 2 different panels at 2 different times. Not only that, has to pay attention on the color, but also on the design and the precise of the how thick and how wide each design and each color has to be, so that way when the 2 panels are seen together, the design has to match. For me, these are some of the things that not only has inspired me tremendously to create maybe very fine pieces, but instead just to appreciate maybe the color combination, maybe how the movement of the elements itself has inspired me tremendously in the Saltillo sarape. And other bodies of work that I have been creating over time is the architectural references in Oaxaca, but also in California modernism, modern architect especially. And perhaps when I look at the what you see here, it's one of the image from one of the most important ceremonial site of the Zapotec people. It's called Mitla. So much of the design, it's inspired, or our community is inspired by, to create designs for our textiles. And for me, it is obviously also a reference. But when I look at the architectural, it is so minimal. It is so simple, so contemporary in many ways. So these are obviously something that is evident in inspiration within my work. And of course, it just reminds me of, the great designers and architecture and artists who arrived in California, United States, many years ago, and that developed what is now known as California modern architect, or modernism, California modernism. And they spent so much in Mexico, so much time in Mexico, specifically in Oaxaca. So a lot of these modernism that started to develop here in California, 50, 16 years ago, was inspired in the ancient Mexico or the indigenous people, or textiles, or archaeological site. And for me, again, this is another reference into my work and honoring where I now live in California, but also honoring where I come from. So in many ways, my work, it is reinterpreting traditional textiles and materials. And these are bodies of work that it's either functional work or work that can only be displayed on the wall. The image that you see here on your screen, it is a body of work that I called rituals. It looks into a petate, a mat that was that has been used in the entire Mexico, but in our community for everyday use and for ceremonies. So it is an installation that I did first at the studio in Oaxaca, and then later on at the Textile Museum in Oaxaca, and other exhibitions here in the States. But the silhouette depicts how these mats or petates was used historically and even today. When someone gets married, the newlyweds kneel and a petate on the altar, in front of the altar in our home, to receive blessings from family and friends. A few generations ago, a petate was also used as a shroud. So for me, my approach as an artist is not only looking into what my ancestor has done when it comes to the traditional design and textile from Teotitlán, but instead I look into overall objects, overall stories, overall narratives and understanding and worldview of my ancestors and what it's alive today in Oaxaca or within our culture. There's so much information that I always resort to and look into in order for me to create a body of work. So these are, I was really drawn by these petates, the movement that they create. They're made out of palm leaves and they're mainly used for bed. So when I was growing up, I grew up sleeping in one as my bed. And again, not many generations ago, people were not only born in it, but they sleep in it, and also it was used as a shroud. But I was really drawn by the movement that the palm leaves creates naturally, because they are exposed to the sun. Some of them are much more are exposed to the sun much longer, so it seems to be more of a brown color. Some are lighter color, so they create this movement by the time they start to be woven. So I was really drawn by those movements. And my most recent work, it's called Continuous Line. This is in interaction of indigenous practice, of ancestral practice, intersecting into a contemporary art practice. So these pieces looks closely into the architectural, specifically the influence of modern architect here in California, because that is the only other art form that I became to be aware of when I migrated here in the United States working at construction. I was actually driving a cement truck. So I came to visit incredibly beautiful homes that at that point I did not know the history of them. But it was the simplicity of movement, deeply attention, or the artist paid deeply attention to the architecture, the movement, the colors, how the light comes into the house and so forth. But also the reference of mitla, the reference of these steps-like movement. So these are work that are framed, 22 thread to an inch, very fine threading, and it was stretched into a frame. A lot of these pieces are actually embroidered. Either the embroidery happened within the loom or after it was off the loom. Some of the designs that you see here continues to honor these movement that the natural dye it's often creates, or the nature, or the different plants would be very sensitive to maybe the pot that is being dyed, so it could easily create this depth and this movement. For me, I use a lot of that within my advantage and create these movements. So here again, we see these step-like, or what we refer to as grecas. This is an embroidery piece. So it was done, the design was done after the piece was off the loom. This is another designs that clearly refer to these designs that we saw in one of the images from Mitla. So it talks so much about this continuous line. When I think about indigenous perspective within migration, or when I think about tradition, how it preserves through the people, and it does not stays on the other side of the border. Instead, it flows through the people. It innovates, it's preserved, but it also moves things forward and acknowledging the present day. Me as indigenous people, my work has focused so much in the land itself as a whole of the Americas. As a Native American or indigenous of the Americas, I don't consider myself a Mexican or American. I just consider myself as indigenous of the Americas. Living in these two countries has obviously bring me tremendous complexity of identity, but at the same time, enrichment. But my work, it still continued to be driven by nature. It's driven by family. It is driven by the seasons that the different plants is providing. Each piece, it really tells, or it's an imprint of each season. What are the plants are available for that season, either in California or in Oaxaca. And reason why I say that my work is driven by nature, it's also because a lot of the plants I use in Oaxaca or indigenous to Oaxaca also grows here wildly up in the river bottoms or in the mountains. So this just for me is just a reminder of that I'm home, that maybe modern society consider me as immigrant, but for me, I am part of this land, and my work is continue to pay homage and honoring this land that I live in now. Thank you guys. I really appreciate again the opportunity to share my work with all of you.
Thank you, Porfirio, so much. Do you want to make any comments about the cochineal and the nopal pad you have behind you before I go to the questions?
Yeah, so the leaves that you see on my behind me here are the prickly pear cactus, and that's where Cochineal insect are farmed or they live. That's where they eat. So what I'm doing here, I'm farming some of the Cochineal insect I use for in my work.
And they've been farmed for thousands of years in Mesoamerica.
Thousands and thousands of years, yes.
I have several questions about the process of natural dyeing using cochineal. So I'll group them together. One is I would like to know what is added to the cochineal to get the various shades of red. Another said that the photo you showed many color variations of red hanks of yarn. Were these all dyed with cochineal with what types of additives? And one person asked if you boil the cochineal when you're making the dye.
It's like using natural dye, specifically cochineal insect. It's extremely complicated. Sometimes it could be seen very something very easy or something just fun and to do. But as a professional artist, you have to pay attention on the temperature. You have to mold it if you're working with either cellulose or protein fiber. That's the starting point, or actually scouring and washing or pre-washing, that's the starting point, more than tin. And then from there, you could start creating a chemical reaction on the mordant itself. So that's where the complexity begin to happen. And you're either using an acid environment and you start getting a more orangey red, these crimson reds. For me, then I have to use a layer of yellow first and then the red. So much of it, it's not just additives, but layering of color and creating this reaction where to create purple, it's either over dye or layering it with indigo, or also other elements like tannin will make that reaction as well.
So another related question, somebody asked, is it normal to cut the nopal pads like you have in the studio, or would they, when they were farmed at the cochineal farms, the nopalerias, would they have been left on the plant to grow?
A couple of different ways that I've seen cochineal insect being farmed is that you could leave the nopal cactus on a pot for, still leave it on the dirt, but having more of a protected so that, well, wild insects are not getting into and infesting or disrupting the farm insect. Otherwise, the leaves are being harvested and then hung like you see here what I do.
So I have a question here from one of our ASM colleagues who will be a speaker later in the series. Dr. Michael Brescia asked, first he thanked you for your presentation, but he asked, from your perspective, which historical period has a greater impact on Zapotec weaving traditions and material culture? The Spanish colonial period or the post-independence period when Mexico broke away from Spain and began to forge a new nation? So which one had the most impact on Zapotec weaving traditions and material culture?
Where it has, the really depending what the question is it the economic impact or how, you know, the tradition has evolved with the material and design? Of course, we see that so much with tourism. I think it's one of the biggest, you know, biggest noticeable changes and influences that we have had, because not only on the chemical dyes encouragement, but also on the, you know, cheaper material, repetitive designs, and also the influence of the wholesalers came to brought with other designs that was not part of our culture, started to be made within the community. That's really, for me, that's probably the most noticeable and maybe the biggest. And after, of course, the arrival of the Spanish, that they brought wool and the loom that we use today.
Okay, so then I have a number of questions here for you. One is, would you mind going back through some of your slides and identifying some of the ancestral Zapotec symbols in your art and what they mean?
Sure. Let me see here. So some of the symbolism, let's say this is one of the very known traditional design, the cycle of life. And it's obviously used more of a band and interlocking into many designs and a band cross and a traditional Zapotec weaving. So the reference of each step represents each stages of our lives from the day we are born. We inquire knowledge and wisdom, and at the end of our journey, the next generation continue our journey. That's why the reference of cycle of life. But when I also think about the symbolism, is how much has gotten lost. And so little we know today, and a lot of the designs, again, another one that's referred to as the butterflies. These are each element referred to as the butterflies that symbolizes, or to us and for so many native indigenous people of Mexico, represents a transition of the or the journey from earthly life, underworld, into the spirit world, and it comes back and visit us through Day of the Dead as a symbol of spirit. This is another greca, another, you know, the steps and these designs that you see on the archaeological site or ceremonial site in Oaxaca. In this particular design, you see the butterflies very clear. But for me, even on these Saltillo sarapes, because so much of has gotten lost again, for me, I'm focusing so much about, because our tradition, or I'm still alive as a Zapotec, so my tradition is still alive. So it is for me so much of meditation and research and understanding, not only historically, but also what is left today, what is still survived through my parents, and they're in the 80s now. So much it's nestled within that information. So a lot of it is referenced. So like this particular design, all the dots that you see around it represents the sacred seed, which are corn, beans, and squash. Some of the textile that was woven right before, or even parallel with when rugs started to be woven or to be referenced in our community. It was these type of garments that was done, and even there's a couple families in Teotitlán that still makes this weaving that uses for harness. So it's garment though, not a blanket, or not or maybe some of them are blanket, but not a rug at all. This type of design depicts either corn or beans, and some of these designs were just corn. That's the name of the piece itself, corn or beans. So when I find out, I was talking to one of the elders in the community, and he was talking about those references. And those are some of the things that I come to meditate about, and what its corn means to us. For my parents, or how I grew up, is that we never saw a kernel on the floor. My dad always says, what is these tortillas just laying around, or why a kernel is on the floor? Can you guys see the sky that is clear, meaning there's no clouds, there's no rain. So I came to understand that corn is sacred to us. And also because when harvesting season, my parents select the most biggest corn kernel or corn on the cob and put some on the altar. And they always say that they want to thank the greater being for another year of harvest. And by the way, for those of you that might visit our village in Teotitlan, the majority of our community members are Catholics. So we have an altar, a dedicated room with an altar of all Catholic homes, where that's our devotion room. And that's where the corns are being placed. And even today, my parents still storage the squash under the altar. So a lot of this understanding and way of growing up, I came to understand and what the sacredness of the corn, beans, or squash. And when I see these dots, like this piece here, I refer to them as the sacred seeds. Is it the Saltillo sarape, is it the same amount of the warp thread or weft? I never really looked at the weft. I've always just focused on the warp, because for me, the warp, it is the most important. That's just my personal understanding, because that dictates how tight or how fine your piece is. Of course, with the thread, the finer the thread, the finer the piece is gonna be, but the piece, it won't be as fine if you have very few warp thread per inch. So the more thread per inch and the finer your thread is, the finer the piece is going to be. I hope that answered that question.
And like I said, Porfirio will be here in person. If you're in Tucson, he'll be with us on October 23rd. He also has a presence on Instagram where you can read his entries, but also ask him questions there. I have a couple questions about who were the weavers. Angeline Duran said, it seems that now men are the primary weavers. Were Zapotec weavers always men, or at some point in deeper history were women the weavers?
Great question. Thank you. Thank you. Historically, women were the weavers. They would do, I could imagine the entire process, and maybe the men helped to harvest some of the elements, but mainly the women that would do the carding, the spinning, and I'm sure the dyeing. When the Spanish arrived, because of the more physical work that required to weave on a pedal loom or Spanish loom, that's how they trained men to weave. And women continued to do the cleaning, the carding, the spinning of the wool, even the dyeing. But after generation and time, and specifically in our community, even the 80s, we still had a mill, a small mill. So as tradition continued to get lost and replaced by machine, the women started to have more time to weave and get involved more in the weaving. So specifically today, you could literally go by some of the places in our community and buy dyed yarn. So you could just go buy yarn that's dyed, and anybody could do that, men and women. But specifically for women, they could just go buy the dyed yarn and start weaving. So much of these processes has been replaced now by either chemical or machine, that the women has much more time to weave. So today it's men and women that weaves.
And Angelina was also wondering if the history of the poncho in Zapotec tradition would have been gendered, would have been men and women wearing it, or just men or just women traditionally?
Mainly it was men that weaving the poncho. I remember some of the stories from my father when he was young. He's 80 now, so when he was young, everybody will have a blanket, and either had a slit in the center or just a blanket. And that's what that was their sweaters. So they'll go and hang out with their friends in town, and they are wrapped around their blankets, or it's just on your shoulder. By the time it gets cold, then it gets wrapped around. And at night, that becomes your blanket. For women, the blanket was their enredo or their skirt. So they wear that during the day. And at night, that turns into their blanket.
And somebody else asked, were rebozos also made by your ancestors along with the sarapes?
You know, rebozos, it's one of those things that historians don't know how they're, no, actually it's the ikat that I'm thinking about, where the ikat come from, because there's also a ikat tradition in Oaxaca, or in Mexico, in Tenancingo specifically. Rebozos, I have not looked so much within the rebozos, to be honest with you. What's the history of rebozos? I couldn't really say much about it.
Okay. So somebody else was wondering if the sheep were brought to Mexico by the Spaniards, or did the indigenous people weave with sheep's wool before that?
The sheep's wool, specifically churro, came to us by the Spanish. My ancestor was using ixtle, or the agave fiber. They were using cotton, primarily feathers, and rabbit fur.
Okay. One person asked if, from your research, if you know if there was an exchange of ideas between Navajo and the Mexican Oaxacan cultures. And I will say that we do have a speaker, Linda Teller, who was speaking in November on Navajo connections to the Saltillo sarape, and Porfirio will be responding at that presentation, but I don't know, Porfirio, if you want to mention anything now.
You know, one thing that I have to say, it is definitely indigenous of the Americas was in contact for who knows how many thousands of years. I don't know how far, but I can imagine they were traveling from way down South America up into the North America. And I could imagine that they had some contact. There is a pueblo in, if I'm not mistaken, in New Mexico, and I can't think of their name. They believe that their ancestors came from Oaxaca, and they do a pilgrimage every year to Oaxaca to reconnect with their culture and visit the land of their ancestors. So there absolutely no doubt that there's definitely a connection, or there was definitely a interaction of the people that lived and still live in this continent as the Americas. That's why the reference that I always say that for some of you that might follow my work in social media, I hardly ever use the word I'm in Ventura, or I'm in like Tucson or New Mexico. I emphasize I'm in Tucson, in this part of the Americas, because to me, it is only one land, and I'm always emphasizing that.
Thanks. And I want to correct myself. It's Linda Teller Pete, and she will be speaking on November 9th. So if you're interested in the connections between Navajo weaving and the Zapotec, and Linda is a master Navajo weaver. So we have a couple more questions here. One to follow up on the poncho question, asking, were men outside in the daytime and in need of shade more, and that is why their sarape was a poncho in the daytime rather than a skirt? Or is there another reason men used it on the shoulders and women used it on the bottom half?
Yeah, well, men didn't use skirt, so it was more of a sweater. You think of it as a sweater. And they only use it, you know, anytime it's getting cold. It was never used, you know, for shade. You're probably referring to one of the images, the horsemen. Those are the Spanish, and those are the landowners that used poncho or a sarape, really fine. And they might have used that most part of the day, but also we see, or I've seen some of my research when they have it just tied to the size of their silla. What does that mean? What would that be for the horse? In Spanish, it would be we refer to as silla when a man wear a saddle. Okay, it's just attached to that. And it was also really fine. So it was not warm, I don't think at all. So, and also it is important to mention that sarape was also a symbol of status and wealth. Indigenous people were not allowed or could not afford to wear a sarape. This is maybe still in the 1800s. And so indigenous people didn't wear sarape up until much more later. But that doesn't mean that they might have not been making something that it's more affordable to them.
And then we have a question. I learned that in parts of Colombia, the diamond shape corresponds to the exact angles of certain sun events. Do the Zapotec diamond shapes have similar angle associations, like perhaps at Nitla?
Yeah, it's also a reference to the ancestor cross, or the Zapotec cross, when it's got the cuatro esquinas cardinales. The diamond, it's obviously something very iconic element within our tradition, that it's obviously be seen on the walls of Monte Alban, or Mitla, I'm sorry. Very traditional design and symbolism within our work. But these are some of the things that me personally, I have not found the symbolism for it.
And then our last question is asking if you could recommend any resources for understanding the imagery and designs that you use in your textiles, or other ones that are more commonly seen in Zapotec textiles.
There's very few books. So in fact, I don't know any that could describe the symbolism within the Zapotec weaving. The community, or us as part of the community, we obviously could still reference in some of the symbolism, but much more so the symbolism is the name, because we learned these names at a very young age, like Walag, which is the leaf, Mariposa, Grecas, Ojo de Dios, and so forth. But really the meaning so much has got lost. And I couldn't recommend any book. I don't really have anything on top of my head at this point that would be relevant for me to recommend.
Well, I will recommend that you come see the exhibit. And we are working on an online exhibit as well. Also, if you're in Tucson, please come join us on October 23rd to meet Porfirio, see his work, talk with him, see him. He and Andrew Higgins and I curated the exhibit, and we will be on hand to do some gallery talks in a safe way for COVID, so that you can learn from them about the different sections of the exhibit. We will also have other activities going on, so bring your family members, and it's a free day at the museum. And Porfirio will have textiles for sale that day. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I particularly want to thank Porfirio for taking his time and sharing the beauty and the knowledge that he has shared with us tonight. Thank you so much, Porfirio.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for having me.